Dostoevsky's drop. The real talk philosophy. Check it. Back in the cold gray streets of 19th century St. Petersburg, this dude walked around who was gonna change how we look at everything. Straight up. His name was Fyodor Dostoevsky, but we're gonna call him Dosti. Dosti wasn't just some writer. Nah, he was a philosopher, a psycho-guru, a prophet, and a total spiritual rebel who was calling all the shots for the 1900s, way before anyone else. Forget what you heard. Long before Freud was talking about the unconscious mind, Dosti had already mapped out all the dark, messed-up parts. Decades before the existentialists were flexing on existence precedes essence, Dosti had already dramatized that truth through characters you just can't shake. Years before those psycho-totalitarian regimes popped off, Dosti predicted exactly how they would run things and why folks would totally buy into the hype. What you're about to hear is every major philosophical idea this genius ever dropped. This ain't just books we're talking about. His stories are packed with the most profound insights into human nature ever written. They dig deep into the questions that have been messing with us since forever. Why do we suffer? What's the deal with being free? How do we find meaning in a universe that looks totally meaningless? What's the connection between good and evil? Can humans actually build a perfect society? Does God exist? And if so, how do we explain when innocent people get hurt? Dosti wasn't some egghead sitting in an ivory tower talking abstract noise. He lived through some traumatic stuff. He was arrested as a young dude for revolutionary stuff and was sentenced to death by firing squad at the last possible second, literally blindfolded in front of the guns. Some messenger rolled up and said his sentence was commuted to hard labor in Siberia. He spent 4 years in a brutal prison camp where he saw the absolute worst of human cruelty and degradation. Dude was going through it. He had epilepsy his whole life. He was hooked on gambling, lost his kids, and was broke for real most of the time. He knew suffering intimately, and that's what gave his philosophical insights a power and authenticity that those purely academic philosophers could never touch. But Dosti was also sharp as a tack. He read everything: philosophy, theology, psychology, and politics. He was vibing with the greatest thinkers of his day and totally understood the intellectual currents that were shaping the modern world. He saw where these ideas were leading, and he was shook by what he saw. He witnessed the rise of materialism, atheism, socialism, and scientific rationalism, and he understood that these supposedly progressive ideas were actually carrying the seeds of total human destruction. He dedicated his life to warning the culture about the danger zone and pointing toward a different path. The philosophy you're about to explore isn't some dry academic theory. It's a living, breathing deep dive into the human soul. It comes alive through characters that feel as real as your own crew. It's dramatized through stories that will haunt you long after you finish them. It's a philosophy born from pain, refined through genius, and dropped as a gift to anyone willing to grapple with the deepest truths about being human. Get ready for a journey into the mind of one of the greatest thinkers who ever lived. Part 1. The Sacred Foundation of Human Freedom. For Dosti, freedom ain't just a political concept. It ain't about voting rights, constitutional protections, or the economy. Freedom is the metaphysical foundation of human existence itself. It's what separates us from animals, machines, and even angels. It's the most precious and most messed up gift we possess. And it's the source of both our greatest glory and our deepest misery. To get Dosti's freedom vibe, you gotta understand what he means by the word. When most folks think of freedom, They just imagine the ability to do whatever they want with no interference. They think of freedom from external constraints. But Dosti is talking about something way deeper and way more disturbing. He's talking about the freedom to choose between good and evil, the freedom to act against your own best interest, the freedom to destroy yourself and others for no rational reason whatsoever, the freedom to say nah to God, to happiness, to love, to life itself. This freedom isn't optional for us. We can't ditch it even if we try. Even when we try to surrender our freedom to some authority figure or system, we are still making a free choice to surrender. Even when we claim that our actions are determined by our genes or how we were raised, we are still freely choosing to accept that deterministic explanation. Freedom haunts every human moment. It's lurking behind every decision, no matter how small or basic. We are locked into being free. No cap. And this condemnation is the source of all our anxiety, guilt, and existential terror. Why would anyone want such a terrible burden? Why would a loving God curse us with such a frightening responsibility? Because without freedom, goodness would be meaningless. A robot programmed to help people isn't morally praiseworthy. An animal acting on instinct isn't showing virtue. Only a being who could choose evil but freely chooses good deserves moral credit. Only a being who could reject love but freely chooses to love is capable of the real deal. But here is where Dosti becomes truly radical. Most people, he argues, cannot handle this level of freedom. It's too terrifying, too heavy, too overwhelming. Most people, when faced with genuine freedom, will do anything to run from it. They will hand over their autonomy to political leaders who promise to take care of them. They will adopt rigid ideologies that tell them exactly what to think and feel. They will lose themselves in addictions, distractions, and mindless pleasures. They will do anything to avoid the terrible responsibility of having to choose who they want to be. This creates a fundamental tragedy. The very thing that makes us human is the thing that most of us desperately want to escape. We want to be free, but we don't want the responsibility that comes with it. We want to make choices, but we don't want to face the consequences. We want love, but we don't want to risk the vulnerability that genuine love requires. Dosti illustrates this tragedy through the underground man, one of the most important characters in all of literature. The underground man is a former government clerk who has ghosted society and spends his time writing bitter notes about life. He is super smart, totally self-aware, and completely miserable. He understands exactly what he should do to level up his life. But he refuses to do it. He sabotages his own happiness, messes up his relationships, and just wallows in his own suffering. Why? Because it's the only way he can assert his freedom. By choosing to be miserable, he proves that he is not a machine programmed for happiness. The underground man would rather suffer as a free being than be happy as a slave. This is the essence of human perversity that Dosti discovered. We will choose suffering over happiness if suffering is the only way to prove our autonomy. We will act against our own interests simply to demonstrate that we are not predictable. We will embrace irrationality as a form of rebellion against any system that tries to reduce us to logical formulas. We are willing to go to hell as long as we can choose hell for ourselves rather than having heaven imposed upon us. This insight has massive implications for politics, psychology, religion, and everything else. Any system that tries to perfect human beings, by eliminating their capacity for free choice, will ultimately fail. Any ideology that promises to create happiness by removing the possibility of choosing unhappiness will breed rebellion and resentment. Any political program that treats people as rational actors, who will always choose their own self-interest, will be surprised by human perversity. But Dostoevsky doesn't stop with this negative insight. He also shows us what freedom looks like when it is exercised in the service of love rather than rebellion. Characters like Alyosha Karamazov and Prince Mishkin demonstrate that it is possible to freely choose goodness, compassion, and self-sacrifice. These characters are not weak or naive. They understand the full horror of human existence, the reality of evil, and the temptation to despair. But they freely choose to respond with love anyway. This positive freedom is not easy to achieve. It requires huge spiritual strength, moral courage, and a willingness to suffer. It cannot be programmed, taught, or legislated into existence. It must be chosen freely by each individual in the depths of their own soul, and it must be chosen again and again, moment by moment, throughout an entire lifetime. This is why Dostoevsky believed that freedom is ultimately a spiritual rather than a political category. True freedom comes not from the absence of external limits, but from the presence of internal grace. It is the freedom to love even when love is not returned, to forgive even when forgiveness is not deserved, to hope even when hope seems impossible. The path to this higher freedom leads through suffering. Suffering breaks down our illusions and forces us to confront the deepest questions of existence. It strips away our facades and reveals who we really are. It teaches us compassion for others. Without suffering, we would remain spiritually immature, incapable of genuine love or authentic choice. Part 2: The Underground Mind and Modern Consciousness. In 1864, Dostoevsky created a character who would become the archetype of modern alienation. The underground man is not just a character. He is a prophetic vision of what human consciousness would become in the modern world. He represents the first fully self-aware neurotic in literature, a man whose intelligence has become his curse and whose self-consciousness has paralyzed him completely. When you understand the underground man, you understand the vibe of millions of people living today. The underground man begins his confession with words that have echoed through philosophy and psychology for over a century. He declares himself to be a sick man, a spiteful man, an unattractive man. But these aren't just random insults. They are precise diagnoses of a new form of human consciousness. He is sick with excessive self-awareness. He is spiteful because his intelligence has revealed how pointless everything is. He's unattractive because his hyperactive mind has made him incapable of natural, spontaneous human connection. The underground man's fundamental problem is that he thinks too much. Back in the day, people could just act on instinct or tradition. But the underground man has been exposed to modern education, science, and philosophical skepticism. He cannot accept anything on faith. He can't act on impulse without analyzing his motives. He can't make any decision without seeing all the possible objections to that decision. He is trapped in analysis paralysis. This excessive consciousness creates a terrible problem for action. He knows exactly what he should do to improve his life, but knowing and doing are two completely different things. He should exercise, but he overanalyzes his motives for exercise until the impulse dies. He should socialize, but he anticipates every possible social awkwardness until he talks himself out of leaving his apartment. Intelligence, which should be humanity's greatest gift, has become his greatest curse. But his problems go deeper than just overthinking. He has also lost the ability to feel genuine emotions. Everything he experiences is filtered through multiple layers of self-consciousness until the original feeling is completely distorted. By the time he finishes this analysis, the anger has morphed into something totally different, usually self-hatred or bitter resentment. He can't feel any emotion purely because his mind immediately starts dissecting and critiquing every feeling. This creates a fundamental alienation from his own inner life. He feels like a stranger to himself. He watches his own thoughts and feelings as if they belonged to someone else. He becomes divided against himself, with one part of his mind constantly observing and judging the other parts. This internal split makes authentic self-expression impossible. Everything he says or does feels fake and calculated. The underground man also suffers from what we now call social anxiety. He desperately wants human connection, but his self-consciousness makes normal social interaction almost impossible. When he enters a room, he immediately starts analyzing how everyone is perceiving him. He notices every face, every tone of voice, every gesture, and interprets them all as evidence of rejection or contempt. He becomes so focused on managing his image that he loses all ability to be genuinely present with other people. He transforms his psychological problems into intellectual positions. He exhibits what psychologists would later call cognitive dissonance. He holds contradictory beliefs and desires at the same time, and the tension between them drives him to increasingly irrational behavior. He claims to value reason above everything else, but then acts in completely irrational ways. He insists that he wants to be left alone, but then gets furious when people ignore him. These contradictions are not accidental. They are built into the structure of modern consciousness. His mind has been modernized, but his heart still yearns for meaning, connection, and transcendence. Dosti shows us that this conflict leads to a peculiar form of suffering that is distinctly modern. The underground man suffers from the inability to believe in anything, to feel anything purely, or to connect authentically with anyone. He suffers from the loss of meaning, purpose, and genuine emotion. This is the suffering of modern alienation, and it's in many ways more devastating than physical hardship because it attacks the very core of what makes life worth living. His response to this suffering is both pathetic and prophetic. Unable to find genuine meaning, he begins to cultivate his suffering as if it were a work of art. He convinces himself that his alienation is actually a sign of his superior sensitivity and intelligence. When people can't find positive meaning, they often start finding meaning in their victimhood or their rejection of conventional values. But Dosti suggests a solution, though it is not an easy one. The underground man's problems stem from his excessive reliance on rational analysis and his disconnection from deeper sources of meaning. He's lost touch with his capacity for faith, love, and self-transcendence. These capacities require a fundamental reorientation of the soul towards something greater than the individual ego. He needs to stop analyzing himself long enough to actually live, to stop protecting himself long enough to love, and to stop asserting his autonomy long enough to surrender to something transcendent. The crisis of modern consciousness was ultimately a spiritual crisis. Part 3. The War Against Rationalism and Scientific Materialism. When Dosti looked at the intellectual trends of his time, he saw humanity rushing headlong towards spiritual catastrophe. The 19th century was all about scientific progress, rational enlightenment, and utopian social planning. Stop. Intellectuals thought that human reason could fix everything, eliminate all suffering, and create perfect societies. They thought science would replace religion, education would eliminate ignorance, and proper social organization would end poverty and crime. But Dosti saw them as dangerous delusions. The fundamental error of rationalism is its misunderstanding of human nature. Rationalists assume people are essentially logical creatures who make decisions based on what's best for them. They think if you show someone their best interest, they'll naturally go for it. But Dosti recognized this as a catastrophic misreading. The problem is that we are not primarily rational creatures. We are emotional, spiritual, and often deeply irrational beings who frequently act against our own self-interest for psychological reasons that have nothing to do with logic. Sometimes we choose to suffer because it feels more authentic. Sometimes we reject good advice because accepting it would mean admitting we need help. Dosti illustrates this hard truth constantly. Raskolnikov, in Crime and Punishment, commits murder, not because it serves his rational self-interest, but because he wants to prove he's extraordinary enough to transcend moral law. The underground man sabotages his own happiness simply to assert his freedom. Ivan Karamazov argues against God, not because the evidence is clear, but because he can't handle the emotional weight of believing in a God who permits innocent suffering. In every case, the behavior is driven by deep psychological needs, not rational calculation. This insight has devastating implications for all those utopian political schemes. If people don't behave rationally, then rational social planning is doomed to fail. Rationalist reformers are trying to solve human problems with tools that are fundamentally inadequate to the task. But Dosti's critique goes deeper. He argues that excessive reliance on reason actually makes human problems worse. When people try to live purely rational lives, they cut themselves off from their own emotional and spiritual depths. They lose touch with the sources of meaning, beauty, and transcendence. Rationalism doesn't solve the human condition, it impoverishes it. Scientific materialism creates even more serious problems. When people start viewing themselves as nothing more than complex machines governed by physical laws, they lose their sense of human dignity and moral responsibility. If all human behavior can be explained by genes and brain chemistry, then free will, moral choice, and accountability become meaningless. Why feel guilty if your actions were determined by forces beyond your control? Dosti saw that scientific materialism would ultimately lead to nihilism, the belief that nothing has any ultimate meaning or value. If humans are just accidental products of blind evolution, our lives have no inherent purpose. The logical conclusion is that existence is fundamentally absurd. This realization drives sensitive people to despair, and less sensitive people to the ruthless pursuit of power and pleasure. The political implications are terrifying. If there are no objective moral truths, then might makes right. If humans have no inherent dignity, they can be manipulated and destroyed without moral qualms. Dosti recognized that this mix of nihilism and rationalism would eventually produce totalitarian movements that treat human beings as raw material for social engineering projects. Dosti's alternative to rationalism is not being anti-intellectual. His critique of reason was based on reason itself, but he insisted that reason must be balanced by faith, emotion, and spiritual intuition. This is why he emphasized the role of suffering in human development. Suffering breaks down our intellectual pride, forces us to confront realities that cannot be understood through reason alone, It opens us to the possibility of grace and transformation. A person who has been broken by suffering and then healed by grace will understand that reality is far more complex and mysterious than any rational system can capture. Part 4. The Psychology of Evil and Human Darkness. One of Dostoevsky's most disturbing insights was his recognition that evil does not come primarily from ignorance or bad social conditions. Evil comes from the human heart itself. This was a revolutionary and deeply unpopular idea in the 19th century, when most intellectuals thought human nature was good and evil was just a social problem. But Dostoevsky had seen too much raw human nature in the Siberian prison camp to accept that optimism. He knew that evil was far more mysterious, persistent, and deeply rooted than social reformers wanted to admit. He expected to find that the criminals in Siberia had been driven to crime by desperate circumstances. Instead, he found that many of them had committed their crimes not out of necessity, but out of choice. Some seemed to enjoy violence for its own sake. Others seemed to have committed murder as a form of self-assertion or rebellion. Still others wanted to experience the ultimate transgression, to see what it felt like to cross the line into absolute barbarity. What freaked Dostoevsky out the most was not that these men were evil, but that they were recognizably human. They were not monsters, just people who shared the same basic psychological setup as everyone else.